Good afternoon. In this lecture, we're going to look at Chapter 9, the Late Baroque period, and we're going to focus on the music of George Friedrich Handel. George Friedrich Handel. His dates are 1685 to 1759. Now, Handel was probably one of the most famous composers in Europe of the Baroque period, probably second only to Bach. Definitely, they were both born in the same year. However, Handel does die a few years after Bach. Now, when we look at Handel and his music, he's most known for writing operas and writing oratorios. Now, oratorios basically are large scale forms of music with choir, orchestra, and soloists. One of the main differences, they're not staged. There's no performers on stage dressed in costumes. There's no elaborate sets. And we're going to talk about an oratorio called the Messiah in this lecture. Now, throughout Handel's career, they categorize it in maybe four periods. In his first period, he was in Hamburg, Germany. Okay, and he's a violinist. And he's a second violinist in the city's opera orchestra, and he was there for a couple of years. And it was important because when he's working as like a second violinist in this orchestra, he really gets exposed to a lot of opera, a lot of Italian opera, and that kind of really is very, very influential on his life. Because Handel definitely, he's a great operatic composer, and he recognizes that this genre is a new emerging genre, and it's something that he wants to be a part of and create. After his stint in Hamburg, he goes to Italy for about 4 years. It's like 10 years. He spends about 10 years in Italy, and he broadens his horizons. And keep in mind, when you travel, especially back then, you get to experience not only just different art and different culture, you get to experience like language, you get the different foods and so forth. Traveling back then was definitely a great opportunity to really get a great worldview. He does spend a brief, he goes back to Germany and goes to Hanover real quickly. He was a music director, but the majority of his life afterwards is spent in London. Okay. He's a German composer who lives in London for the majority of his life, from 1710 to 1759. And he goes to London. He does write multiple operas. His idea was he was hoping to succeed in writing opera seria or serious opera. Okay. But he's very, very successful in London. In fact, he's invited to write music for King George. He basically, and when the king asks you to write music for him, you made it. He was a big deal. Okay. Orchestral dance suites. So in the Baroque era, it was a very popular trend to write a suite of dances or a series of dances. Okay. And lots of times these dances were written for a single instrument or for orchestra. Okay. And you might have, 6 to 7 different specific dances in an entire suite. And a suite would be like a collection of pieces. Many of you have heard of like Tchaikovsky's Nutcracker Suite. It's a ballet, but it's a collection of dances. Okay, in this case, we're going to look at Handel's Water Music Suite, which is a collection of dances. Okay, many of these pieces are going to be in binary form, which is that A-B form. Okay, some pieces are going to be in an A-B-A form, like the minuet we're going to look at. And the B section of the minuet is what we call a trio. So if you look below, lots of times, with Handel's suites, they'll start off with an overture, okay? And then there's a series of dances. A hornpipe is a type of dance. A jig is another type of dance. An air is another type of dance. And within these specific dances, there's specific styles or tempos that it gets associated with them, okay? Now, one thing to be clear about is many of these dance suites are to be played, and they're modeled after dance forms and dance rhythms, but they're geared to be listened to and not actually danced to. Okay. Handel's water music. Okay. Now, the water music was that Suite of Pieces, written for full orchestra. Okay, it was written around 1717, and the piece was designed to be played on a barge going down the Thames River in London. Okay, and what would happen is, you can see if you look at the picture, the king's barge would be floating down the River Thames, and the musicians would be situated next to them. Okay, and this was one of the popular things to do during this time. You'd sit back and listen to an evening concert on the river. And so, as the story goes, the king enjoyed the music so much of Handel, he says, "Listen, can you play the piece again?" And as I said, when the King of England says, "Hey, play that piece again," that kind of really, really, establishes you as the prominent musician of the era of the time. Handel's Water Music. So we're going to listen to the Minuet and Trio from the Water Music. Okay, so it's just going to be the one movement from a piece that has multiple movements to it. The form is going to be an ABA form. So we're going to hear the A section. We're actually going to hear the A section twice, and then we're going to hear the B section, which will be called the trio section. And the trio section, traditionally with a minuet and trio, is contrasting. So if the A section is in a major key, maybe the trio section might be in a minor key. Or if the A section is very, very lively and boisterous, well, the trio section may be more like lighter and lyrical. Okay. So the A section starts off in this piece with horns. Let's listen. Next, in the second part of the A section, we hear the trumpets. Let's listen. Now, this trio section is going to sound like this. It's contrasting, so let's listen. And as you can see, the trio section, it's a contrasting. It's a minor key. It's using most of the strings, not the full brass or the trumpets and the horns. So it's definitely it has a different tone to it. Okay, so when we listen to this piece, pay attention for that. Try to be able to identify the A section of the minuet. Try to be able to identify that trio section of the minuet, and then of course after the trio, we'll repeat back to that A section again. Handel and opera. Now, as I said, Handel worked back in Germany as a second violinist for an opera company. So he got exposed to a lot of different operas in the Baroque era. He spent time in Italy as well, which I'm sure he saw in numerous operas. And he was a huge fan of opera, especially one specific type of opera called opera seria. And opera seria is basically, it's serious opera. Okay, it's not comic opera and so forth. Most all these operas are going to have serious plots, either based on historical figures or Greek or Roman mythology. Okay, keep in mind the Baroque period, even the classical period, a lot of operas are going to be based on Greek myths, Roman myths, and so forth. Most times, in opera, we're going to see a lot of males singing both roles. Okay, in opera, and we see a lot of males roles usually sung by a castrato as well. Now, castratos were very, very popular in Baroque opera, and then they kind of faded out towards the end of the classical period. And again, and we talked about this, I believe, in their Renaissance period. Women weren't allowed in the church to sing, so what they do is they would take church boys before they hit puberty. They would castrate them to preserve their voice, and they would have a very, very high vocal quality, be able to sing very, very high notes. So castratos still existed in the Baroque period in opera. And again, and then they start to fade out probably by the 1800s. Now, Handel did have a great success with opera. He had great success from 1710 to about 1728. But he founded the Royal Academy of Music, his opera company. It did go bankrupt in 1728. So what does he do? Well, he goes from opera and then starts writing oratorios. And in the next slide, we'll talk about why oratorios are kind of like the moneymaker for Handel. Continuing talking about opera. In this slide, you can see a picture of it's the title page of Handel's opera, Julius Caesar. And just remember, this is one of those operas that, I said in Julius Caesar, he's basing his operas on storylines from Roman and Greek mythology or Roman history in this case. Oratorios. Now, oratorios became very, very popular in the Baroque era. And what makes them popular? Well, first off, they were large-scale works of art, work performances, okay? You're using full choir, orchestra, soloists, okay? And then most of these pieces were about it could be an hour and a half, 2 hours long. They involved, they had overtures, they had arias, recitatives, and then full choral movements as well. Almost all these oratorios, though, differ from opera because they're performed, but there's no scenery, there's no costume. So it's basically like going to a choral concert with orchestra and soloists. Okay, and one of the things that really producers were drawn to this and musicians were drawn to this because it was less expensive. It was cheaper to produce oratorios than operas. Okay, so if you had a limited budget, you were doing an oratorio. Okay. Many times these oratorios are divided into acts, okay? And in addition, a lot of these oratorios had a religious narrative or religious overtone to it, okay? For example, Handel's Messiah is about the birth of Jesus Christ and then the resurrection and so forth. One other aspect of oratorios is the chorus usually functions to, has a more of a dramatic function in these oratorios as well. Maybe it's commenting on the drama, maybe it's commenting on the action, where the soloists would have more of a narrative. They would be either portraying characters in the stories and so forth. Handel's Messiah. So the Messiah was written in 1741. It was composed in about 3.5 weeks, which is very, very quick for an oratorio. Okay, remember it's about 2 hours long. This work. The work is probably the most famous piece that Handel's written, and most everyone here you've heard the Hallelujah chorus from the Messiah. Okay, the first performance was in Dublin as a charity benefit. Okay. And then the actual structure of the Messiah is in 3 parts or 3 acts. Act 1 is the prophecy and birth of, Jesus Christ. The Act 2 focuses on the gospel. And then Act 3 is, the resurrection and the victory over death. Keep in mind, many of these oratories, as I said, have religious connection or religious overtone to them. Continuing talking about the Messiah, we're going to look at the recitative and aria, "Art thou that tellest good tidings from Zion." So we start off first with the recitative, and the soloist, sings the recitative. And remember, the function of a recitative is to inform the listeners of the plot or what's coming and so forth. Whereas the arias are more about singing about maybe an emotion and so forth. So when we start off with this recitative, we're going to hear the harpsichord playing roll chords with the bass continuo, and we'll hear the soloist singing, but with a very free, kind of looser rhythm. Let's listen.
Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel.
Next, we'll head into the aria. And the aria is structured with an instrumental ritornello, and then the soloist will sing, and it will go back and forth from the instrumental ritornello to the soloist, ritornello, soloist. And then finally, towards the end, the chorus will sing the main melody, kind of to help wrap the piece up. Let's listen to the instrumental ritornello. Now, let's hear the soloist sing the melody.
O thou that hast good tidings to Zion, get thee up into the high mountain. O thou that hast good tidings to Zion, get thee up into the high mountain. Get thee up into the high mountain.
Now, finally, once we get towards the end, the chorus is going to come in singing the main melody. Let's listen. Continuing talking about Handel's Messiah. So we're going to look at the Hallelujah Chorus. And the Hallelujah Chorus concludes part 2 of the Messiah. And it's a piece that's very, very famous, probably Handel's most famous piece that he's written. And it's a piece that everyone's familiar with. And for us, it's a great way, Handel, basically, it's a great masterful use of contrasting textures within this piece. Handel uses a monophonic texture, polyphonic texture, and a homophonic texture all throughout this piece. And there's a juxtaposition as we go through for effect. So I'll give 3 examples here. I'm going to play each of these examples, and I want you to try and identify what texture that Handel's employing. Okay? The first one sounds like this. Now, if you said that's a monophonic, you would be correct. It's just the one line singing. The next example, the kingdom of this world is become the kingdom of our Lord and Christ. Let's listen. So if you said that that's going to be a homophonic texture, you would be correct. And then we have, and he shall reign forever and ever. Let's listen. So that's going to be parts of Handel's Messiah. Oh, sorry. So yeah, and he shall reign is going to be a polyphonic texture. So let's go back and let's listen to the Holiday Chorus in its entirety so we can, understand it. And also listen to the aria recitative as well on canvas. So this concludes Chapter 9, focusing on the music of George Friedrich Handel. Tune in next time for Chapter 10 when we'll start focusing on the classical period.